The crystal chandelier cast dancing shadows across the marble floors of the Blackstone mansion as tech billionaire Harrison Blackstone hosted his monthly dinner party for the city's elite. The dining room buzzed with conversations about market volatility, political scandals, and the latest acquisitions that had made headlines in the financial press. Harrison, worth approximately $14 billion from his revolutionary software empire, sat at the head of the mahogany table like a king surveying his court. At 45, Harrison had earned his fortune through a combination of brilliant programming skills, ruthless business tactics, and an ego that matched his bank account. He was known throughout Silicon Valley not just for his technological innovations, but for his arrogant dismissal of anyone he considered intellectually inferior, which included virtually everyone who wasn't worth at least 9 figures. The problem with most people, Harrison was saying to his dinner guests, his voice carrying the condescending tone that had made him both feared and resented in business circles, is that they mistake access to information for actual intelligence. Anyone can Google Translate these days, but true linguistic mastery requires a level of cognitive sophistication that simply can't be taught. His guests nodded appreciatively, a mix of investment bankers, tech executives, and old-money aristocrats who enjoyed Harrison's intellectual theatrics almost as much as they enjoyed his expensive wine. Among them sat Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, a linguistics professor from Stanford, and Ambassador Chen Wei, a retired diplomat who spoke 7 languages fluently. Speaking of linguistic challenges, Dr. Hartwell said with a slight smile, "I brought something tonight that might interest you, Harrison. It's a passage written in an obscure dialect that's been stumping graduate students for months." She pulled out an ancient-looking manuscript from her purse, its yellowed pages covered in elegant script that seemed to flow like water across the parchment. The writing was beautiful but completely incomprehensible to most of the guests, who leaned forward with curiosity. "This was discovered in a monastery in Tibet," Dr. Hartwell explained. "It's written in a dialect that was used by a small sect of Buddhist monks over 800 years ago. The language is so obscure that only a handful of scholars worldwide have ever attempted to translate it, and most have failed." Harrison examined the manuscript with the intense focus he typically reserved for lines of computer code. His ego was immediately engaged by the challenge, especially with his distinguished guests watching his reaction. How difficult could it possibly be? Language is just another form of pattern recognition, and pattern recognition happens to be my specialty. Ambassador Chen chuckled softly. "Harrison, my friend, I've been studying languages for 40 years, and I can tell you that this particular dialect requires not just linguistic knowledge, but deep understanding of Buddhist philosophy, Tibetan cultural history, and medieval monastic practices. It's not simply a matter of translating words." "Nonsense," Harrison replied, with the supreme confidence that had made him billions but also countless enemies. "Complex problems require systematic approaches. Give me an hour with this document and access to my research databases, and I'll have it decoded." Dr. Hartwell shook her head gently. "Harrison, I've had teams of experts working on this for 6 months. The dialect is so specialized that it requires someone who not only understands the linguistic structure, but also possesses intimate knowledge of the specific religious and cultural context in which it was written." Harrison's competitive instincts flared to life. Throughout his career, he'd built his reputation on solving problems that others claimed were impossible, on seeing patterns that escaped lesser minds. The idea that some ancient scribbling could stump him was personally insulting. "Tell you what," Harrison said, his voice taking on the theatrical tone he used when making grand gestures, "I'll make this interesting for everyone. If anyone in this room can provide an accurate translation of that document tonight, I'll write them a check for my annual salary. All $14.7 million of it." The dinner guests erupted in surprised laughter and excited chatter. Several immediately pulled out their phones to attempt online translations, while others began discussing the linguistic challenges involved. Harrison basked in the attention, confident that his generous offer was completely safe, since no one present could possibly meet such an impossible challenge. "Harrison," Ambassador Chen said thoughtfully, "are you certain about this wager? That manuscript represents centuries of specialized knowledge." "Absolutely certain," Harrison replied smugly. "I've spent my entire career proving that problems other people consider impossible are simply problems they lack the intelligence or determination to solve. Besides, what's the point of having money if you can't use it to make interesting bets?" For the next 2 hours, Harrison's guests took turns attempting to decipher the mysterious text. Dr. Hartwell consulted her linguistic databases, Ambassador Chen applied his diplomatic language training, and even Harrison himself spent 45 minutes with his laptop, running the text through every translation program and linguistic analysis tool he could access. But the ancient script remained stubbornly indecipherable. The characters seemed to shift meaning depending on context, and the philosophical concepts embedded in the text required cultural understanding that no computer program could provide. As midnight approached, Harrison felt increasingly confident that his fortune was safe. "Well," he announced with satisfaction, "I think we can safely conclude that this particular puzzle is beyond the reach of modern translation capabilities. Perhaps those medieval monks were more clever than we give them credit for." The guests began gathering their coats and preparing to leave, their conversations turning to other topics as the linguistic challenge faded into an amusing dinner party anecdote. Harrison felt vindicated in his belief that he possessed intellectual capabilities that distinguished him from ordinary people. But as the last guests departed and Harrison prepared to retire to his study, he noticed that Maria Santos, the family's housekeeper, was still quietly cleaning the dining room. Maria had worked for the Blackstone family for 12 years, arriving each morning before dawn and leaving after the family's needs were completely met. At 58, she moved through the mansion with the efficient invisibility that wealthy families expected from their domestic staff. Harrison had barely spoken to Maria in all the years she'd worked for him, treating her as little more than a piece of furniture that happened to dust other furniture. He knew virtually nothing about her background, her education, or her life outside the mansion walls. To him, she was simply the help, reliable, unobtrusive, and completely unremarkable. "Maria," Harrison called out casually as he gathered Dr. Hartwell's manuscript from the table, "you can finish cleaning tomorrow. It's getting late." Maria paused in her work, her weathered hands still holding the silver serving tray she'd been polishing. "Signor Blackstone," she said quietly, "forgive me for listening, but I could not help hearing about the translation challenge." Harrison looked up with mild surprise, not accustomed to his household staff initiating conversations about anything beyond their immediate duties. "Oh, that. Yes, well, it turned out to be quite impossible, as I suspected it would be. Some things are simply beyond human comprehension." Maria hesitated for a moment, clearly weighing whether to speak further. "Signor, may I see the document?" Harrison laughed condescendingly, the sound echoing through the empty dining room. "Maria, this manuscript stumped professors and diplomats. It's written in a dialect so obscure that scholars spend decades studying it without success. I appreciate your curiosity, but translation work requires rather specialized knowledge." But something in Maria's steady gaze made Harrison reconsider his dismissal. Perhaps it would be amusing to let the housekeeper look at the document, if only to demonstrate the vast intellectual gap between his educated guests and the domestic staff. He handed her the manuscript with a patronizing smile. "By all means, take a look. Though I should warn you, even the most sophisticated translation software couldn't make sense of it." Maria accepted the ancient pages with reverent care, her fingers tracing the elegant script as if greeting an old friend. As she read, her expression changed from polite interest to focused concentration, and finally to something that looked remarkably like recognition. "Signor Blackstone," Maria said slowly, "this is not as impossible as you think. The text is written in classical Tibetan, mixed with Sanskrit, but it uses a specific dialectical form that was employed by the Gelug school of Buddhism during the 13th century. Harrison's condescending smile faltered slightly. "Maria, I think you're confusing this with something else. This dialect has been studied by experts for months without success." "With respect, Senor," Maria continued, "the experts may not have understood the cultural context. This passage is not meant to be read as a simple translation. It is a philosophical meditation that requires understanding of both linguistic structure and spiritual meaning." She cleared her throat and began to speak, her voice taking on a different quality as she shifted from broken English to the flowing cadences of someone completely comfortable with complex ideas. The text begins, "In the silence between heartbeats, the wise student discovers that emptiness and form are not opposing forces, but complementary aspects of the same eternal truth. As the mountain exists both as solid stone and as the space that defines its shape, so does the enlightened mind embrace both knowledge and unknowing as paths to the same destination." Harrison stared at Maria in growing shock as she continued translating the manuscript with apparent ease, her voice carrying the rhythm and poetry of someone who truly understood both the language and the philosophy embedded within it. The master teaches not by filling the student's cup with wisdom, but by showing the student that the cup itself is an illusion. When the seeker stops grasping for answers and begins dwelling in questions, the boundary between teacher and student dissolves like morning mist before the sun. As Maria continued her translation, Harrison felt his worldview shifting in ways that made him profoundly uncomfortable. This woman he'd dismissed as nothing more than hired help was demonstrating a depth of knowledge that surpassed his distinguished dinner guests, speaking with the authority of someone who'd spent years studying subjects he'd never even contemplated. True wealth cannot be counted in gold or measured in lands, for it exists in the moments when the heart recognizes its connection to all beings. The poor man who shares his last grain of rice with a stranger possesses riches that the emperor hoarding treasures in his palace will never comprehend. The irony of that particular passage was not lost on Harrison, who realized he was hearing profound wisdom about wealth and human value from someone he paid barely above minimum wage to clean his toilets. Maria continued translating for another 10 minutes, rendering the complex philosophical concepts into beautiful, comprehensible English, while maintaining the poetic structure and spiritual depth of the original text. When she finished, the dining room fell silent, except for the ticking of Harrison's antique grandfather clock. "Maria," Harrison said finally, his voice barely above a whisper, "how is this possible? Where did you learn to read classical Tibetan?" Maria set the manuscript down carefully, her expression returning to the quiet deference she typically showed her employer. "Senor Blackstone, before I came to America, I was not always a housekeeper. I had a different life, a different education." "What kind of education?" Harrison pressed, his arrogance temporarily replaced by genuine curiosity. Maria hesitated, clearly uncomfortable discussing her personal history. "I was born in Peru, but I spent 20 years studying in monasteries throughout Tibet and Nepal. I was training to become a Buddhist teacher, specializing in the translation and interpretation of ancient texts." Harrison felt the ground shifting beneath his assumptions about intelligence, education, and human worth. "Then why are you cleaning houses?" "Because life sometimes gives us choices we do not expect," Maria replied simply. "My husband became very sick, and we needed money for medical treatment. We came to America, but my qualifications were not recognized here. A doctorate in Buddhist philosophy from a Tibetan monastery does not qualify someone for academic positions in American universities." The revelation hit Harrison like a physical blow. For 12 years, he'd employed one of the world's leading experts in ancient Buddhist texts to scrub his floors and wash his dishes, never once considering that she might possess knowledge that dwarfed his own understanding in certain areas. "Maria," Harrison said slowly, "you realize what this means, don't you? I offered my annual salary to anyone who could translate that document." Maria nodded quietly. "Yes, senor. But I do not expect you to honor such a promise. I know it was meant for your educated guests, not for the help." Her words stung Harrison more than any business rival's insult ever had. She expected him to break his word because she understood exactly how he viewed people in her position, as invisible, unimportant, unworthy of the same respect he showed his wealthy peers. "You're wrong about that," Harrison said, reaching for his checkbook with trembling hands. "A promise is a promise, regardless of who fulfills the conditions." As he wrote out a check for $14.7 million, Harrison realized he was not just paying a debt, he was confronting the ugly truth about his own prejudices and assumptions. He'd spent decades believing that worth was measured by wealth, that intelligence was reflected in job titles, that education could only be found in prestigious institutions. "Maria," he said, handing her the check, "I owe you much more than money. I owe you an apology for 12 years of treating you as invisible, when you're clearly one of the most remarkable people I've ever met." Maria stared at the check in disbelief, her hands shaking as she held what represented more money than she'd earned in her entire life. "Senor Blackstone, this is too much. I cannot accept such a sum." "You can, and you will," Harrison said firmly. "You earned it through knowledge and skill that I could never match. But more than that, you've taught me something far more valuable than any business lesson I've ever learned." "What is that, senor?" Harrison looked around his opulent dining room, seeing it differently than he had just hours earlier. "You've taught me that wisdom doesn't come with price tags, that intelligence can't be measured by bank accounts, and that I've been blind to the remarkable people around me because I was too arrogant to actually see them. Over the following weeks, Harrison's relationship with Maria transformed completely. He learned that she spoke 7 languages fluently, held degrees in philosophy and comparative religion, and had spent decades studying with some of the most respected spiritual teachers in Asia. Her work as a housekeeper had been a necessity, not a reflection of her capabilities or aspirations. With her newfound financial security, Maria chose to start a small translation service specializing in ancient religious texts, but she also continued working part-time for the Blackstone family, not as a servant, but as a cultural advisor and teacher. Harrison found himself spending hours discussing philosophy, spirituality, and the nature of human wisdom with someone he'd previously dismissed as intellectually insignificant. The story of Harrison's humbling spread quickly through Silicon Valley's elite circles, becoming a cautionary tale about the dangers of intellectual arrogance and the importance of recognizing that wisdom can emerge from the most unexpected sources. Some of his peers mocked him for being outsmarted by the help, but Harrison had learned to value different measures of success and intelligence. 3 months after that life-changing dinner party, Harrison stood before the board of directors of his company, announcing a new corporate initiative that would provide educational scholarships and professional development opportunities for all employees, regardless of their current position within the organization. "We've made the mistake of assuming that a person's job title reflects their potential," Harrison told the surprised board members. "We've overlooked brilliant minds because they happen to be working in maintenance, food service, or administrative support. Starting today, we're going to invest in discovering and developing the hidden talents that exist throughout our organization." The program, dubbed the Maria Santos Initiative with her permission, became a model for other companies and helped identify dozens of employees whose skills and knowledge far exceeded their current roles. Former janitors became IT specialists, cafeteria workers transitioned into management positions, and security guards were discovered to possess advanced degrees in engineering and science. But the most profound change was in Harrison himself, who had learned that true intelligence includes the wisdom to recognize one's own limitations and the humility to learn from anyone willing to teach. His arrogance had been replaced by curiosity, his condescension by respect for the diverse forms of human knowledge and experience. On a quiet evening 6 months later, Harrison sat in his study with Maria, both of them working on translating another ancient manuscript that had been discovered in a monastery in Mongolia. The billionaire and the former housekeeper worked as equals, united in their shared fascination with wisdom that transcended cultural and temporal boundaries. "Maria," Harrison said as they paused their work, "I need to ask you something that's been bothering me. Why didn't you ever mention your background before? Why did you let me treat you as if you were uneducated for all those years?" Maria considered the question thoughtfully, her weathered hands folded over the ancient text. "Because pride is a luxury that poor people cannot afford, Senor Harrison. I needed work, and you needed a housekeeper. My ego was not more important than my family's survival. But it must have been frustrating, watching my guests struggle with problems you could have solved easily." "Sometimes the greatest teacher is the one who waits for the student to be ready to learn," Maria replied with a gentle smile. "You were not ready to see me as anything more than a servant until the night you discovered that knowledge comes in forms you had never considered." Harrison nodded, understanding that Maria's patience and wisdom extended far beyond her linguistic abilities. She had taught him the most important lesson of his life not through confrontation or demands for recognition, but by simply being herself when the moment was right. The millionaire had scoffed at the translation challenge, confident that his salary was safe from anyone in his household. But the maid's answer had done more than stun him. It had awakened him to the reality that wisdom often wears the most humble disguises, waiting patiently for pride to step aside so that real learning can begin. In revealing her extraordinary knowledge, Maria Santos had not just won a fortune. She had demonstrated that the most valuable treasures are often hidden in plain sight, overlooked by those too arrogant to recognize that intelligence, dignity, and wisdom can never be measured by job titles, bank accounts, or social status. The crucial translation had been provided by the one person Harrison least expected to succeed, and in her success, she had translated more than ancient text. She had translated his understanding of human worth from arrogance to humility, from blindness to sight, from prejudice to respect. 1 year after that transformative evening, Harrison Blackstone stood at the podium of the International Conference on Corporate Social Responsibility, addressing an audience of CEOs and business leaders from around the world. But he wasn't alone at the podium. Beside him sat Maria Santos, now recognized as Dr. Maria Santos, having had her credentials formally evaluated and accepted by several American universities. "Ladies and gentlemen," Harrison began, his voice carrying none of the arrogance that had once defined his public speaking, "I want to tell you about the most expensive lesson of my life and why it was worth every penny." The audience chuckled, expecting another story about a failed investment or costly business mistake. They had no idea they were about to hear about a housekeeper who had revolutionized a billionaire's understanding of human worth. 12 months ago, I believed that intelligence could be measured by bank accounts, that wisdom was the exclusive domain of the educated elite, and that anyone working in service industries simply lacked the capacity for higher thinking. I was spectacularly, embarrassingly wrong. Harrison gestured toward Maria, who smiled with the quiet dignity that had never left her despite her changed circumstances. "Dr. Santos taught me that brilliance often disguises itself as humility, that wisdom frequently works in silence, and that the most profound teachers are often those we're too proud to recognize as our equals." The story of the translation challenge had become legendary in business circles, but Harrison wanted his peers to understand the deeper implications of what had happened in his dining room that night. "The real lesson wasn't about ancient languages or religious philosophy," Harrison continued. "It was about the criminal waste of human potential that occurs when we judge people by their current circumstances rather than their inherent capabilities. For 12 years, I employed one of the world's leading experts in Buddhist studies to clean my floors because I was too arrogant to see her as anything more than the help." In the audience, several CEOs shifted uncomfortably, recognizing their own biases reflected in Harrison's confession. Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, who had brought the manuscript to that fateful dinner party, sat in the front row with tears in her eyes, proud of the transformation she had inadvertently catalyzed. "But this story isn't just about my personal awakening," Harrison said, his voice growing stronger. "It's about the systematic changes we've implemented at Blackstone Industries to ensure that every employee's potential is recognized and developed, regardless of their starting position." Maria rose to address the audience, her transformation from invisible housekeeper to respected corporate consultant evident in her confident bearing. "When I first came to America," she said, her English now polished but retaining the warmth of her accent, "I thought my choice was between pride and survival. I chose survival, accepting work that didn't reflect my education or abilities because my family needed security." She paused, looking out at the sea of powerful executives. "But what I learned from working in Mr. Blackstone's home is that every person carries hidden depths, secret knowledge, unexpected wisdom. The janitor might be a poet, the security guard might be an engineer, the cook might be a philosopher. We lose so much when we judge people by their job titles instead of their humanity." The Maria Santos initiative had grown beyond Blackstone Industries, inspiring similar programs at dozens of companies worldwide. Workers who had been overlooked for years were discovering that their employers were finally willing to see their full potential. Night shift custodians were becoming IT specialists, cafeteria workers were transitioning into management roles, and administrative assistants were revealing advanced degrees in fields completely unrelated to their current positions. "The program has identified over 300 employees whose skills and knowledge far exceeded their current roles," Harrison explained. "We've provided educational support, career development opportunities, and most importantly, the recognition that every person deserves to be seen for who they truly are, not just what they currently do." But perhaps the most significant change had been in Harrison himself. His legendary arrogance had been replaced by genuine curiosity about the people around him. He made it a practice to have lunch with employees from every level of his organization, learning their stories, understanding their aspirations, and discovering the remarkable diversity of knowledge and experience that existed within his company. "Dr. Santos," an audience member called out, "what would you say to other workers who feel their abilities are being overlooked or undervalued?" Maria smiled thoughtfully. "I would tell them that patience and excellence are powerful forces. Continue to do your current work with dignity and skill, but also look for opportunities to reveal your true capabilities. Sometimes the right moment comes when you least expect it, and when it does, be ready to step forward with confidence." She looked toward Harrison with genuine affection. "And I would tell them that people can change. Mr. Blackstone's transformation proves that even the most entrenched prejudices can be overcome when someone is willing to confront their own blindness and grow from the experience. After the conference, Harrison and Maria sat together in a quiet cafe near the convention center, reflecting on how far they'd both traveled from that night in the dining room when ancient Tibetan wisdom had bridged the gap between employer and employee. "Maria," Harrison said, using the name she preferred despite her doctoral title, "I've been thinking about something you said that night about true wealth. You quoted the text about sharing rice with strangers versus hoarding treasures. I'm starting to understand what those monks meant." Maria nodded, stirring her tea slowly. "Wealth shared multiplies, while wealth hoarded diminishes the soul. You discovered this when you chose to honor your promise despite your surprise at who had earned it." "I've been wondering," Harrison continued, "what would have happened if I hadn't made that ridiculous bet? Would I ever have learned about your background?" "Eventually," Maria replied with certainty. "Truth has a way of surfacing when it's needed most. Perhaps it would have taken longer. Perhaps it would have happened differently. But wisdom always finds a way to reach those who are ready to receive it." Harrison smiled, understanding that their relationship had evolved into something far more valuable than employer and employee. They had become teacher and student to each other, with the roles shifting depending on the subject matter and the moment's needs. "There's something I've never told you," Harrison said. "That night, when you started translating the manuscript, I felt something I hadn't experienced since I was a child. Genuine awe at someone else's knowledge. It was humbling and terrifying and wonderful all at once." "And there's something I never told you," Maria replied. "When you wrote that check without hesitation, when you chose to honor your word despite your shock, I saw the decent man you were capable of being underneath all that arrogance. That's when I knew our relationship could become something meaningful." 3 years later, the Blackstone Mansion had been transformed into a cultural center and retreat facility, where business leaders came to study ancient wisdom traditions and their application to modern corporate challenges. Maria had become the center's director, while Harrison had stepped back from day-to-day business operations to focus on philanthropy and education. The dining room where the translation challenge had taken place was now a classroom where Maria taught courses on Eastern philosophy and cross-cultural communication. The manuscript that had started it all was displayed in a place of honor, along with a plaque that read, "Wisdom often comes disguised as service. The wise student learns to recognize teachers in every form." Harrison often sat in on Maria's classes, no longer as the arrogant billionaire who had once dismissed her expertise, but as a lifelong student committed to understanding the deeper truths that transcended wealth and status. His transformation had become a case study in business schools around the world, an example of how profound personal change could create ripple effects that improved entire organizations and communities. But the most lasting impact of that night wasn't measured in corporate programs or educational initiatives. It was seen in the quiet respect between two people who had learned to value each other's wisdom. The friendship between a former billionaire and a former housekeeper, who had discovered that true wealth lies not in what we accumulate, but in what we learn from each other. The millionaire had scoffed and offered his salary to anyone who could translate an ancient text, confident that his money was safe. The maid had answered with wisdom that spanned centuries and cultures, stunning him not just with her knowledge but with the revelation of his own blindness to the remarkable people around him. In the end, the $14.7 million had been the least expensive lesson Harrison ever received, because it had taught him that the most valuable treasures are often hidden in plain sight, waiting for the moment when pride steps aside and allows true learning to begin. The translation had been perfect, but the transformation it catalyzed had been priceless. Sometimes the greatest teachers come disguised as servants, and sometimes the most profound wisdom speaks with the quiet voice of someone the world has taught us to overlook. In recognizing Maria's brilliance, Harrison had found his own humanity, and in that discovery, both their lives had been immeasurably enriched. The ancient Tibetan monks who had written that manuscript centuries earlier would have smiled to know that their words about recognizing wealth in unexpected forms had traveled across time and culture to teach a modern lesson about the universal truth that wisdom and worth cannot be measured by social status or bank accounts, but only by the depth of understanding and compassion we bring to our interactions with every person we meet. The end.